The dying sun of Scifi Prime cast a sickly orange light over the once great capital city. What was once a jewel of crystal towers and floating gardens now stood cracked and hollow. Wind howled through abandoned streets, carrying the echoes of voices that had fallen silent long ago. Deep inside the royal palace, Queen Siraxa VII sat alone on her massive throne. Her eyes, once sharp and full of command, stared at the marble floor. She wore a crown of black metal and flowing robes of deep blue silk. But the power behind these symbols had faded. She raised her head as her old advisor. A thin, gray-scaled alien named Kale entered the empty hall. He bowed low, but there was no pride left in the gesture. "Your Majesty," Kale said softly, "the council waits for your final word." Sirax's voice was dry. What word do they expect from a queen who can give them nothing? She touched her stomach through the folds of her robe. Once that part of her body was the symbol of hope. It was called the living throne, the orifice that brought new Zephyrians into the world. But now it was silent, dead inside her. No more heirs. No more future. "They want to hear that you will step down, Your Majesty," Kale said. His voice trembled. He had served her family for 50 cycles of their long years. He loved his queen like a daughter. But even he could not deny the truth. They believe there is nothing left to try. Siraxa turned her eyes to the high windows. Above the throne, through the cracked glass, she could see the fading sun, a cold sphere that would soon fail, just like her people. She had tried everything: ancient medicines, forbidden prayers, lost science. Nothing worked. "My orifice is useless," she said, not in anger, but in quiet surrender. "I am useless." Kale lowered his head. He could not find words to comfort her. There were none left, but far from the dying palace, in a small human outpost on the edge of the same star system, a young xenobiologist named Mason Price listened to Sirax's words. He sat alone in a dusty lab surrounded by flickering screens and stacks of old research. His hair was a mess, and his eyes burned from days without sleep. Mason leaned closer to the comms unit. Sirax's broadcast was not meant for humans. It was an old signal sent through the ancient galactic channels, a final cry for help that most would ignore. But Mason didn't. He watched the Queen's tired face on the screen as she spoke to her council. He listened to her admit defeat, and something inside him burned with anger, not at her, but at the universe for letting hope die so easily. Mason had come to this forgotten outpost for the same reason as Sirax's people: survival. Earth was overpopulated, so humans spread like seeds across the stars. Mason had studied alien genetics for years. He had dreamed of making contact with the Zephyrians, who were once famous for their advanced bioengineering. But when he arrived at this sector, he found only ruins. Now, staring at the Queen's face, he made a decision. He switched on the old transmitter and called his only friend at the station, a retired pilot named Joe. "Joe," Mason said, his voice shaking with excitement. "Fuel up the freighter. We're going to Scifi Prime." Joe's voice crackled through the speaker, rough and full of disbelief. "Have you lost your mind? The place is under isolation. They don't want help. They want to die quietly." "I'm not giving them help," Mason said. He packed his notes into a battered case. "I'm giving them a chance. If they can't see it, I'll make them see it." He shut off the comms and grabbed his coat. The desert winds outside howled against the small outpost walls, but he felt alive for the first time in years. Hours later, under the dull hum of the freighter's engines, Mason looked at the stars stretching out before him. Somewhere on that cold planet, a queen sat in silence, believing she was useless. He clenched his fists. "Not if I have anything to say about it," he thought. Humans don't quit, not ever. When Mason's ship arrived at Scifi Prime's orbital ring, he found only ghosts. Dead stations drifted in slow circles above the planet. Old satellites blinked out ancient warnings in dozens of languages. He forced his way through the clearance codes, overriding systems that hadn't seen a human signature in decades. Finally, he found a landing corridor still active. He guided the freighter through thick storm clouds and acid rain. The planet's atmosphere burned the ship's shielding, but Mason pushed forward. He would land at the royal palace itself if he had to. When the ship's hatch opened, Mason stepped out in a worn-out spacesuit. His boots crunched on the cracked marble of the palace's main courtyard. Black spires rose above him, reaching for the dying sky. Wind tore at the royal banners, shredding them like old cloth. A line of palace guards, in silver armor, aimed their spears at him. They looked thin and tired, but their eyes burned with suspicion. Mason raised his hands slowly. "I'm not here to invade," he shouted over the wind. "I'm here to talk to your queen." One of the guards stepped forward, his spear inches from Mason's chest. "No humans allowed," he said in a dry hiss. "Leave or die." Mason looked past them at the giant palace doors. He could almost feel Siraxa inside, waiting to surrender to her doom. "Listen to me," Mason said. His voice was firm, strong.
No?
"Your queen thinks her throne is useless. I can prove her wrong. If you want to die, kill me now. But if you want to live, take me to her." The guards looked at each other. The wind howled around them. Finally, the leader lowered his spear, made a quick motion, and the others stepped aside. "Follow," said. Mason took a deep breath, stepping into the shadows of the ancient palace. Above him, the towers groaned in the wind. Ahead, the queen waited, and so did a chance to make history. Mason followed the guards through the dark marble halls of the palace. His boots echoed on the cold floors as wind whistled through cracked windows. Once, this place had been alive with music and laughter. Now, only silence and dust remained. At every corner, Mason saw statues of past queens, tall, proud figures carved in black stone. They seemed to watch him as he walked, their eyes cold but curious. Mason felt small under their gaze, but he kept moving forward. Kale, the queen's old advisor, waited at the door to the royal chamber. His eyes narrowed when he saw Mason. "A human," Kale said. His voice was sharp, tired, but still proud. "What makes you think you can help where our greatest minds have failed?" Mason set his heavy bag down at his feet. He straightened his back and met Kale's eyes. "Because humans survive, we adapt. Sometimes we do the impossible, just because we refuse to give up." Kale studied him for a long moment. Then he stepped aside and pushed open the heavy doors inside. Queen Siraxa the Seventh sat on her throne, exactly as Mason had seen her on the broadcast, dressed in deep blue, crowned heavy on her head, eyes tired but sharp. The ceiling above her was made of stained glass, cracked and leaking thin beams of dying sunlight. She looked at Mason like he was a ghost. "A human dares to stand before the throne of the stars?" she asked softly. Mason dropped to one knee. He did not know the right words of respect in her culture, so he used his own. "Your Majesty," he said, "I know your people think your throne is broken, but I believe it's only sleeping, and I can help wake it." Siraxa laughed, but it was not a cruel laugh. It was sad, soft, almost kind. "I have heard every promise from every corner of my empire. I have drained the old vaults of science and magic. And now you, a single human, say you have an answer?" Mason stood up. "I studied Xipherian genetics for 10 years on Earth. I came here hoping to learn from your people before I knew you needed help. Now I see you do. Humans have genetic tools you abandoned long ago. If we combine what we know with what you have, we can try something new." Siraxa leaned forward. "New or forbidden?" "Maybe both," Mason said. He did not flinch. "Your council will hate me. They will call me an intruder. But I didn't come here to watch you die. I came here to remind your people that hope can be built even from the pieces everyone else throws away." The queen's eyes glowed faintly under the glass ceiling. Kale stepped up beside her, whispering into her ear in their soft musical language. She listened without looking at him, her eyes locked on Mason. When Kale fell silent, Siraxa asked, "And what do you want, human Mason, in return for your miracle?" Mason shook his head. "I want to see your people live. I want your knowledge, shared with mine. I want the Xipherians to rise again, and remember that humanity helped them stand when they were ready to fall. For the first time in years, Siraxa smiled, just a flicker at the corner of her lips. "You ask for an alliance," she said. "One that my council will never accept." Mason spread his hands. "Then let them fight me. I won't run." The Queen looked at Kale. The old advisor seemed ready to protest, but Siraxa lifted her hand to silence him. She rose from her throne, her long robes whispering across the cold floor. She stepped down the stairs, standing close enough for Mason to see the faint scars on her temples, marks left by old medical treatments that had failed her. She studied his face, the rough stubble on his jaw, the tired lines under his eyes, the small badge of earth on his collar. A small, fragile human in a dead palace, daring to promise life. "You are bold," Siraxa said quietly. "But boldness alone does not make miracles." Mason nodded. "No, but boldness makes them possible." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Siraxa lifted her chin. "Very well, human Mason. You will have access to the royal gene forges under Kale's watch. You will show me this impossible path you claim exists." Kale looked ready to argue, but Siraxa silenced him with a gesture. She turned her eyes back to Mason. "But hear me, human. If you lie to me, if you fail me, I will let my people decide your fate, and they do not forgive easily." Mason felt a cold sweat run down his back, but he did not look away. "I accept your terms." Kale stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Follow me, then. We have much to prepare and little time to waste." The gene forges were deep below the palace, hidden behind ancient vault doors and guarded by old AI sentries that watched Mason with glowing red eyes. Kale's handprint and the Queen's personal code were needed to open each door. Inside, forge chamber was a giant sphere of metal and glass, humming with old power. Tubes and glowing tanks lined the walls, full of half-forgotten samples. The air smelled sharp and clean, recycled for centuries without ever touching the outside world. Mason walked through the forge like a pilgrim, touched old consoles, brushed dust from control panels, and ran his fingers across the smooth surfaces of ancient machines. "This is incredible," he whispered. "Your people built wonders." Kale's voice was tired, but proud. "We did. But we also bound ourselves in chains of tradition. We stopped changing, and so we began to die." Mason opened his bag and pulled out a small silver case. Inside were vials of human genetic material, seeds of life from Earth's greatest labs. He held them up to the forge's scanners. "If I can merge this with your DNA," Mason said, "we can strengthen your people's cells, fix what's broken, wake what's sleeping." Kale narrowed his eyes. "You speak as if it is so easy." "Not," Mason said. He gave a small, tired smile. "It will be the hardest thing I've ever done. But I didn't come all this way to play it safe." Hours turned to days as Mason and Kale worked under the cold lights of the forge. They mapped. Genes ran tests, argued about what was possible and what was not. Mason found old codes buried in the forge's memory, hidden research from when the Zyfarians were young and fearless. Some nights, Siraxa came to watch them work. She said little, but her presence gave Mason strength. In her eyes, he saw the spark of something returning, a fragile hope that maybe her throne was not useless after all. One night, as Mason adjusted a glowing vial in the incubator, he whispered to himself, "Humans don't quit. Not ever." And for the first time, since she had declared herself useless, Siraxa believed him. Deep under the royal palace, the gene forge hummed day and night. Mason and Kale barely slept. The old machines flickered back to life under Mason's careful hands. Broken consoles were repaired with spare parts from the human freighter. Queen. Siraxa often came down in silence. She would stand on the metal walkway above Mason and Kale, watching them through the misty glass. Sometimes she asked questions about human science. Other times, she only listened to the hum of machines she once believed were dead forever. One night, Mason placed his hands on a large glass tank filled with glowing blue liquid. Inside, small strands of Zypherian DNA floated, mixed with the stronger, flexible strands of human code. This was the heart of his plan, to heal the Queen's line. By weaving it together with human strength, Kale watched him carefully. "You risk much," the old advisor said. "If the Council learns what you do here, they will destroy you." Mason didn't look up. "They can try." Kale tilted his head, his scaled face thoughtful. "Why do humans always speak as if you cannot fail?" Mason gave a tired smile. "'Cause if we fail, we get back up. If we can't get back up, someone else stands for us. We win because we don't know how to stay beaten." Kale fell silent, and for a moment, the old hall seemed to breathe with the memory of a proud past. As days passed, the work became more dangerous.
Ow.
Rumors spread among the palace guards that the human was using forbidden science.
Ow.
Some whispered that Mason planned to take the Queen's throne for himself. Mason ignored the rumors. He focused on the gene maps glowing on his tablet, the humming tanks, the samples he carefully combined. Every new test was a step into the unknown. Siraxa watched him closely. She began to ask questions not as a ruler, but as a student. "Do you think this will work?" she asked one cold night while Mason adjusted the incubator's heat. Mason answered honestly, "'Cause your people have the gift to shape life. Mine have the will to push past limits. Together, we make something new. Something your council fears because they don't control it." Siraxa looked at the swirling light inside the incubator. "They will call it unnatural," she said softly. Mason turned to her, tired eyes fierce. "Nature doesn't care what we call it, it only cares what works. Do you want your people to live or die, pure and perfect, but gone forever?" Siraxa lowered her eyes. Her long fingers touched the glass of the tank. "I want them to live." But even in the hidden forge, danger crept closer. One evening, Mason and Kale heard footsteps echo through the old tunnels. The AI sentries flickered. Red Kale rushed to the monitors. On the screens, they saw shadowy figures slipping past the outer gates. "It's the Council's spies," Kale whispered. "They come to see if the rumors are true." Mason wiped sweat from his brow. "Then let them see." He turned to Kale. "Can you lock the inner doors?" Kale typed ancient codes into the forge's main console. The heavy doors sealed shut. With a deep, echoing clang, Mason grabbed a small tool. It wasn't a weapon, but it would have to do. Moments later, heavy knocks shook the metal doors. Voices outside barked in the Zypherian tongue, demanding the lab open immediately. Inside, Mason and Kale stood side by side in the flickering light. Siraxa joined them, her robe sweeping across the metal floor. She looked calm, her eyes burning with a quiet fire Mason had never seen before. "They will break through soon," Kale said. Siraxa nodded. "Let them come." She looked at Mason. "Will your work survive if they destroy this place?" Mason thought quickly. "No. But if we can get the samples and data out, we can start again. If they take that, everything dies here tonight." Kale opened a hidden panel under the main console. Inside was an old escape tunnel. "Go," he told Mason. "Take the samples. I will delay them." But Siraxa stepped forward. "No, I will delay them. Kale, you take Mason. Protect the future." Kale looked like he wanted to argue, but the Queen's eyes left no room for it. Mason opened the incubator, pulling out the small container holding the hybrid DNA. He tucked it inside his suit. "I won't run forever," he promised Siraxa. She touched his shoulder gently the first time she had ever done so. "I know, human Mason. But tonight you run, so tomorrow you can fight." Outside the doors, the Council's guards brought heavy cutters. Sparks flew as metal screamed. Mason and Kale slipped into the dark escape tunnel just as the first door gave way. Inside the forge, Siraxa stood tall before her old Council's spies. Her crown gleamed under the cold lights. For the first time in years, her voice thundered. "Through the forge, you come here to chain the future," she said. "But the future is already free." The tunnel was narrow and cold. Mason and Kale ran through the shadows, the walls lit only by the faint glow of old emergency lights. Mason held the DNA sample tight against his chest. Every few meters, The tunnel shook with distant echoes of shouting and metal smashing against metal. Finally, they emerged in an abandoned transport dock beneath the palace. Mason's freighter sat hidden behind piles of broken ships. "Hummed quietly, Joe." The old pilot sat inside, waiting just like Mason had asked. Cale turned to Mason, breathing hard. "The Queen gave you her trust tonight. Do not waste it." "I won't," Mason said. He looked back at the tunnel's dark mouth. He could almost feel Syraxa standing alone in the forge, holding back the tide. Mason clenched his fists. "I swear she won't stand alone for long." Above them, inside the palace, the council's spies dragged Syraxa back to her throne room. They shouted for her to step down. They accused her of treason against tradition. But for the first time, Syraxa felt no fear. She had seen what hope looked like in human eyes, a wild, stubborn spark that could burn through iron walls. She sat tall on her throne once more, its eyes unyielding, as her people's future slipped through the tunnels and into the waiting stars. Mason sat alone in the small observation deck of his freighter as it drifted through deep space. Outside the window, stars stretched like silver dust across the black. The hum of the engines and the soft clicking of the life support were the only sounds that reminded him he was still alive. On the table in front of him, sealed inside a protective case, rested the small container of hybrid DNA, the fragile seed of a new future. He reached out and placed his hand on the case as if he could feel it breathing. Behind him, the freighter's door hissed open. Cale stepped inside. Ah! The old Zypherian's long robe brushed the metal floor. He looked tired, his scales dull under the ship's white lights, but his eyes were sharp. "You have not slept," Cale said. Mason didn't turn around. "I can't sleep. Not yet." Cale stepped closer, resting one hand on the back of Mason's chair. "You saved the seed. Now, you must grow it. Cannot do that if you break yourself first." Mason gave a humorless laugh. "I spent years studying your people's genetics. I thought I was ready. But I didn't plan for a palace siege and an empire ready to eat itself alive." Calais lowered himself into the chair opposite Mason. "Sometimes we must light a fire under rotten roots to force new growth." Mason looked up at Cale. "And what if we fail? What if Syraxa's sacrifice means nothing?" Cale did not smile, but his voice softened. "Then we fail together, and we try again until we do not fail." The freighter's old pilot, Joe, called Mason to the cockpit. Through the cracked viewport, Mason saw their destination, a hidden orbital station built centuries ago by traders who no longer existed. It floated above a dead moon, its old lights flickering like fireflies in the dark. "This place safe?" Joe asked. He flicked switches as he spoke, his gray hair sticking out from under a faded cap. "As safe as anywheres now," Cale answered. "The Council fears old secrets, will not search where their ancestors buried their shame." The freighter docked with a deep shudder. Mason felt the ship's weight settle into the old station's hold like a sigh. The docking clamps clicked shut, echoing through the thin walls. Inside the orbital station, dust drifted in the air like ghosts. Ancient banners hung in torn shreds from the ceiling. Cale led Mason and Joe through narrow metal halls until they reached a sealed lab, hidden behind a rusted door that only opened when Cale entered an old code. Inside, the lights flickered on. Rows of machines blinked awake for the first time in decades. Cryotanks lined the walls, half buried in frost. Mason walked slowly through the lab. His fingers traced the consoles, the scanners, the empty storage tubes. "Why was this place abandoned?" he asked. Cale's eyes darkened. "Long ago, our people dreamed too big. They tried to grow new forms, soldiers, leaders, even whole cities of life made from nothing. They feared what they created, so they buried it here, locked away." Mason set the DNA container on the main console. "Then it's the perfect place to finish what we started." Days passed in the hidden lab. Mason worked without rest, his hands moving like clockwork over wires and vials. He built new incubators from old parts. He mixed the hybrid code into cell samples, then watched them grow under ancient microscopes. Cale gathered what supplies he could from the freighter. Joe kept watch at the dock, listening for any sign that the Council's ships might find them. Sometimes, Masan caught Kale watching him, a strange look in the old advisor's eyes, like hope and doubt fighting inside his mind. Finally spoke the question that haunted him. "Do you think she's still alive?" he asked. Kale didn't pretend not to understand, Saraxa. He nodded slowly. "They would not kill her quickly. They will try to break her spirit first. To force her to speak against you?" Mason clenched his fists. "She won't. She'd die first." Kale placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then do not let her die for nothing." The first real breakthrough came on the 12th day. Under the microscope, Mason saw the hybrid cells split and grow without flaw. Where old Xipherian DNA twisted on itself and collapsed, the human code held it together like a living bridge. Mason called Kale over. Together, they watched the cells swim in the clear fluid, strong, healthy, alive. Kale let out a breath Mason hadn't known he was holding. "It works. It works, Mason," repeated. He leaned back, wiping tears from his tired eyes. "But it's not enough. We need hosts, a whole new line. We need volunteers." Kale looked away, his scales shifting color in thought. "Finding those who would risk the Council's wrath will not be easy." Mason crossed his arms. "And we don't find them. We inspire them. The Council rules by fear. Let's remind people that fear can break." They gathered their first allies in secret. Old traders, young workers, exiled scientists. They came to the station one by one, slipping past the Council's patrols and hidden cargo ships. Each brought food, tools, and stories of Sarax's stand. Against the Council's threats, they listened to Mason as he showed them the healthy hybrid cells under the microscope. They saw what it meant, a chance to heal generations of broken lines, save their queen, to stand proud again. And so, the first volunteers stepped forward, young and old, weak and strong. They offered their own DNA, their time, their trust. They became the roots of something new, a seed of rebellion, growing in secret in the cold dark above a dead moon. Mason stood at the observation window again, watching small shuttles drift away from the station toward hidden colonies on other worlds. Each shuttle carried tiny vials, small but powerful. Beside him, Kale held a worn data pad. "This is no longer your plan alone," Kale said quietly. "It belongs to them now." Mason nodded. "It was never mine alone. It's hers, Sarax's, and theirs, and ours." Kale's eyes narrowed at the stars. "The Council will come. They will crush us if they can." Mason's reflection in the glass looked back at him, tired, determined, unbroken. "Then they'd better be ready to crush every star in the sky," he said, "because we're not going back into the dark." In the old lab behind him, new life pulsed under glass. And in the cold halls of the dead station, whispers grew louder. Stories of a queen who refused to bow, human who refused to break, and an empire that would not die quietly. Word of the hidden station spread like quiet thunder through the stars. Small traders carried secret messages hidden in crates of fruit and metal parts. Dock workers whispered rumors while lifting cargo. In the dark corners of old cities, young Xipherian rebels told each other tales of Queen Saraxa and the human who dared stand beside her. The Council tried to crush these whispers. They sent patrol ships to hunt Mason's freighter. They raided old trader docks and questioned anyone who looked like they knew too much. But the rumors were seeds already buried deep. On the old orbital station above the dead moon, the hidden lab pulsed with new life. Mason stood at the center of it, moving from tank to tank, checking each new batch of hybrid cells. Around him, a growing team of volunteers worked day and night. Some learned to run the machines, others carried crates of supplies from hidden freighters that arrived under cover of asteroid fields. Kale, once just Sarax's old advisor, had become something more. He moved through the station like a quiet shadow, comforting frightened volunteers, sending coded messages to trusted allies on distant worlds, and keeping the station's location hidden from Council spies. One day, Kale found Mason hunched over a console. Mason's eyes were red from lack of sleep. His hands were stained with the blue fluid from the gene tanks. "You must rest," Kale said softly. "I will," Mason muttered, not looking up. After this batch stabilizes, Kale placed a hand on his shoulder. You do the work of 10 people, human. But even 10 people need sleep. Mason finally looked up, and for the first time in days, he let out a tired laugh. If you keep nagging me, Kale, I'll think you care. Kale's eyes softened. I do care, Mason. So does she. At the mention of Syraxa, Mason's smile faded. He leaned back and stared at the ceiling, seeing the Queen's proud face in his mind. Any news? He asked. Kale shook his head. No word from inside the palace. The council's blockades grow tighter every day. Mason clenched his fists. We're running out of time. The longer she's their prisoner, the weaker our fire grows. Kale leaned closer. Then we must give the people something stronger. Then whispers. The next plan was dangerous, reckless. But so was every plan worth anything. Kale reached out to old allies in the undercity of the Zypherian capital. Secret couriers carried Mason's message through the council's checkpoints. The Queen is alive. The future lives in your hands. In hidden meeting halls, rebels passed around tiny vials of hybrid DNA, proof that the old royal line could be reborn stronger than ever. Those who saw the glowing cells understood the council could not silence. The future, if enough voices rose together, Mason knew it wouldn't be enough to hide in the dark forever. He needed a spark in plain sight, needed the people to see the truth with their own eyes. So he went back. One cold night, Mason Kale and a small team of trusted rebels boarded a disguised cargo hauler. They slipped through the edge of the blockade using old smuggler tricks, hidden compartments, false codes, a pilot who knew how to fly like a ghost through a storm. They landed on the dark side of the capital's old industrial sector. Abandoned factories rose like black teeth against the night sky. Mason and Kale slipped into the shadows, carrying the most precious thing they had, a living host. Growing the new royal line inside her, a young volunteer named Sira, who had offered her body so that Syrax's people would have hope. Sira walked at Mason's side, calm despite her shaking hands. I'm not afraid, she whispered as they moved through rusted gates and broken walls. I know, Mason said. He smiled at her, a real smile, warm and proud. You're braver than you think. Kale led them through secret tunnels below. The factories at the far end, a hidden door opened into a wide chamber once used for storing minerals. Now, it was filled with people, workers, old traders, street children, scholars. They had gathered in silence, waiting for the promised spark. When Mason stepped into the light, whispers rose like wind in tall grass. Many had never seen a human before. Even more had never seen the tiny glowing incubator that Sira carried close to her chest. Kale raised his hands. This is the future they fear, he shouted, his voice echoing off the steel walls. The council hides your queen in chains, but they cannot chain hope. Mason stepped forward, standing beside Sira. He held up the incubator for all to see. Inside, a small cluster of living cells pulsed with gentle blue light. This is Syrax's legacy, Mason said, his voice calm but strong. A new line, stronger than before. Zypherian and human together. They can break our bodies, but they cannot break what grows in the dark. A young rebel stepped from the crowd. His clothes were dirty, his hands rough from factory work. He fell to his knees before Sira and Mason. Tell us what to do, he said. His voice trembled, but his eyes burned with the same wild spark Mason had seen in Syrax's eyes. Mason looked at Kale, then back at the growing crowd. Help us protect this. Help us spread it to every corner they cannot watch. When the time comes, stand with us. Stand for her. A murmur of agreement rose. More voices joined. A chant started, low at first, but growing louder. For the Queen. For the future. Back on the orbital station. Joe watched the stars from the freighter's old cockpit. He knew the plan was dangerous. He knew the council would come for them harder than ever now. But he also knew something had changed. The people were no longer afraid to speak. They were no longer afraid to hope. In the royal palace, Syraxa sat. In her cold chamber, her wrists chained to a metal chair. Council guards stood at the door. Looked tired, but her eyes burned bright when Kale's secret message reached her. A single line on a stolen data chip slipped under her door. By a servant who never looked back. The seed lives. The fire spreads. Hold fast. Siraxa closed her eyes and let a single tear fall. Not from sadness, but from a hope too strong to break. In hidden tunnels and old stations. In the minds of rebels and the hearts of exiles, the quiet thunder of a new empire grew. The council ships circled like hungry wolves. But inside the dark, something brighter than fear began to shine. Cold wind blew through the broken towers of the Xipherian capital as dawn's first pale light painted the sky. Below, the old factories and hidden tunnels breathed with new life. People who once hid in fear now stood shoulder to shoulder, passing secret messages, carrying small crates, guarding hidden paths. In the center of it all stood Mason. Dirt and oil stained his hands and clothes. He hadn't slept in days. But there was a light in his eyes that had nothing to do with sleep. Kale stood at his side, old but unbowed. Around them, the volunteers moved like silent rivers, preparing for what would come next. "Are they ready?" Mason asked, his voice low. Kale watched the crowd of workers and traders gathering by the factory gates. Some held tools that had become weapons. Others wore old armor pieced together from scraps. "They are as ready as any army born from shadows can be," Kale said. Mason looked at him, trying to read the thoughts behind those tired eyes. "Is this enough?" Kale placed a hand on Mason's shoulder. "No rebellion ever begins ready. But the people are awake now. They have something worth more than weapons." "Hope," Mason said softly. Kale nodded. Hoped. Deep inside the royal palace, Queen Siraxa heard the distant rumble of footsteps echo through the stone floors. She sat straight in her chains, head high despite the bruises on her arms and the cruel iron around her wrists. Her guards shifted nervously as the noise grew louder. Shouts, boots, the sound of doors breaking open. One guard stepped forward, voice trembling. "Your people are in the streets, my queen. They come for you." Siraxa's eyes, dark and sharp, glowed with quiet fire. She smiled for the first time in weeks. Outside the palace walls, the council's guards formed tight lines. Heavy guns pointed at the crowds that filled the wide plaza. Mason stood among the front line of rebels, the cold metal of an old pistol heavy in his hand. Sira, the young host who now carried the living seed of the new royal line, stood beside him. Her face was pale but fearless. Kale stepped forward, raising his hands. He called out to the council's guards, his voice clear above the noise. "Stand down. The people will not be chained again." A council officer barked back. "You bring ruin, old man. You bring war." Mason raised his own voice, strong enough for even the farthest people to hear. "No, you brought ruin when you chained your queen, when you broke your people's hope. We only remind you who you really are." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. The guards looked at each other, doubt flickering behind their helmets. Among the crowd, voices rose. "Let her go. Let her go." The line broke. One guard lowered his weapon, then another. A third pulled off his helmet and dropped it on the ground. The council officer shouted orders, but they fell flat. The people surged forward, not with blind rage, but with steady, stoppable courage. Mason led the push through the gates. Kale stayed at his side, staff in hand like a battle standard. Sira walked behind them, her hands resting on the small container hidden inside her coat. It's the living promise of tomorrow. They stormed the palace halls not with burning hate, but with clear purpose. Council banners fell from the walls. Old marble floors echoed with the footsteps of a free people rising again. When Mason reached Siraxa's chamber, he found her waiting. She sat straight, despite her chains, chin high, eyes sharp as stars. "Mason," she said, her voice hoarse but proud. "You came back." Mason knelt beside her, his fingers fumbling with the old metal locks. "I promised I wouldn't leave you in the dark." Her chains hit the floor like thunder. Siraxa stood slowly, her legs trembling but unbroken. Kale dropped to one knee before her, his old voice thick with emotion. "My queen." She rested her hand on his head, then turned to Mason. "The people," waiting, Mason said. He gestured to Sira, who stepped forward and lowered her hood. Sirax's eyes widened when she saw the small container pulsing with blue light against Syrah's chest. "Is it true?" she whispered. "It's true," Mason said. "Your line lives on, stronger, freer. No more broken bodies, no more fear." Siraxa closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened them again, they were sharp with command. "Then let us show them the dawn." They stepped onto the palace balcony together, the queen, the human, the old advisor, and the young host. Below them, the plaza overflowed with people. When they saw Siraxa, a roar rose so loud it shook the stones. She raised her hand for silence, her voice when it came. Act carried to every corner of the plaza and every heart that waited in the shadows beyond. "They told you I was broken," Siraxa called out. "They told you your hope was useless. They told you to bow your heads and accept their rule." She held out her hand to Mason, pulling him to stand beside her. "This human came to us when we had no future. He did not run from our weakness. He helped us find our strength." Siraxa stepped to Syrah and gently placed her hand over the living seed. This is proof that no chain can hold us forever. Our future grows stronger than any council decree." She turned back to the crowd, her voice rising like the sun. "This empire does not belong to the council. It belongs to you. All of us." A cry rose from the plaza. Not just a cheer, but a promise, spoken by thousands of voices together. No more chains, no more fear. Far above the palace, council ships circled like vultures. But as the people filled the streets, as guards laid down their weapons, and as old banners burned, even the ships began to drift away powerless before a city that had woken up that night. Under a sky filled with new stars, Mason sat beside Siraxa in the palace gardens. The air smelled of broken stone and fresh flowers. The people still chanted outside the palace walls, but for now, there was peace. Siraxa looked at Mason. Her voice was soft but strong. "You gave me back more than an empire, Mason. You gave my people a reason to stand tall." Mason leaned back against the cold marble. He looked at the stars, the same stars that had once seemed so far away when he worked alone in a hidden lab. "We gave it to each other," he said. "Together." Siraxa smiled, tired but unbowed. Somewhere inside the palace, the new life Syrah carried grew quietly like a tiny sun waiting to rise, and in every hidden corner of the stars, people whispered the same words. "Hope lives, the empire stands. We are not afraid."